Well, first I'd like to express my appreciation and gratitude to James Badiner, who unfortunately due to a schedule problem wasn't able to make it, and thus I am here in his stead. I'd also like to thank Ben Sessa and David Luke and the other David and all the organizers for manifesting this extraordinary event, and also the other speakers and the staff and the volunteers and everyone who's been part of making this gathering possible with us today. My own qualifications for speaking with you today are, well, they pale in comparison to the prominent scientists and researchers, many of which that fill the schedule. In terms of personal field experience with psychedelics, I'm also decidedly a neophyte. I am actually curious. Will all those who have not experienced LSD, please raise their hand. Oh, thank you. I always thought I was alone. Okay. So, for my part, there have been a fair number of journeys with the mushroom teacher and with other plant teachers. Some interesting buying time with Terence McKenna in his botanical dimension garden in Hawaii, and a fair amount of experience with the newer class of entheogens popularized in our circles by Ann and Sasha Shulgin. But the points I'd like to make here today derive more from the academic exercise of putting together a book about Buddhism and psychedelics called Zigzag Zen, Buddhism and Psychedelics. Alex Gray curated some of the most compelling and strikingly beautiful art for the book from a variety of artists. Thank you again, Alex. He's not here, is he?
No, he's not. He's Skyping later.
Oh, he's Skyping later. Okay. And also Eric Davis, who is speaking here today or tomorrow as well, and contributed a wonderful essay to the book. It's been over a decade since Zigzag Zen was released, based largely on a special section of this subject in Tricycle, the Buddhist Review, in the fall of 1996. The book was published by Chronicle Books, the first of its kind in terms of closely examining the relationship between psychedelics and Buddhism through a variety of voices and perspectives. I was expecting it to cause a firestorm of criticism and concern by Buddhists with a capital B, but that didn't turn out to be the case. It's somewhat disappointing, actually, because I thought the controversy would drive book sales even more. Each of the 33 contributors had a different story to tell, different substances, different circumstances, different experiences, and different lessons drawn. For some, it was a story about giving into temptation, suffering a lack of clarity, or worse, lasting confusion and perhaps addiction. For others, it was a brief glimpse into a rarefied world of intense sense impressions, accompanied by fanciful but perhaps useless images. But for others, still, it was the very threshold of their journey into the truth of the Buddhist teachings, with unforgettable, if fleeting, images. All the contributors had a significant story to tell, and each person's facet of the truth on drugs and dharma remains riveting and revealing. My 20-year fascination with Buddhism is primarily how it shows up in the challenges of modern life, how it informs our struggles and our social problems. My earlier books focus on Buddhism in relation to economics and globalization, and also Buddhism and the ecological crisis. But why psychedelics? Well, certainly the use and abuse of drugs are a social and legal problem, created, of course, mainly by those who think it is a problem, or those who would like it to be a problem. The structures and thinking in place to control drug use in our society, in my opinion, actually drives the lion's share of abuse and inappropriate use. Now, psychedelics lurk. I do hear it. What's up? Yeah. Is it interfering with?
Yes. Better without.
Without mic?
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe it's entities.
Yes. Still here? It's gone now? Okay. Maybe it was the rustling of my jacket. Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. It's back?
It's feedback from the mic. It's not.
The gremlins are back.
It's feedback, yeah.
Okay. Let me take this off. of you know if you can't hear me. Well, psychedelics lurk in the personal histories of most, if not all, first-generation Buddhist teachers in Europe and America. Today we find many teachers advising against that they once followed. The fifth precept, the Buddhist admonition against drinking intoxicating liquors, is frequently touted as the end of conversation with respect to the use of psychedelics, regardless of the sincerity or the intensity of higher purpose motivating such a journey. Can you hear in the back? Okay? Okay. In fact, the intentional use of consciousness expanding psychedelics for personal growth purposes obviously has very little in common with, for instance, imbibing a bottle of gin. Nevertheless, the intentional use of consciousness expanding psychedelics for personal growth purposes, along with Buddhism and psychedelics, share a great deal in common. The acute attraction to mindfulness and present moment awareness and the primacy of direct experience. In their purest applications, they share the same ultimate purpose, the liberation of the mind. Few Buddhists make the claim that psychedelic use is a path itself. Some maintain that it's a legitimate gateway, and yet others, acutely aware of the inconvenient duality that undermines any chemically dependent spiritual path, feel Buddhism and psychedelics don't mix at all. But just as Buddhism itself, according to its founder, must be held to the test of personal experience and the wholesomeness or unwholesomeness of the results, so must also the question of how or if psychedelics can be a legitimate part of Dharma practice. Buddhism is a path of freedom, the Suddhimagga in Pali. So we all must be free to experience and make these choices for ourselves. Encouraging critical examination and analysis and the freedom to make these discoveries for oneself is an essential component of Buddhism, and it's found back as far as the Kalama Sutra. The Kalamas lived in an area of northwest India called Kesaputa. They were primarily of the merchant class. The Buddha was advising them on how to verify the truth, and I think his advice on this bears quoting in some detail. "Do not go upon what has been acquired by repeated hearing," said the Buddha, "nor upon tradition, nor upon rumor, nor upon what is scripture, nor upon one's surmise, nor upon an axiom, nor upon logical reasoning, nor upon a bias towards a notion that has been pondered over, nor upon another's seemingly keen mind, nor upon the consideration that this monk is our important teacher." The Buddha warned the Kalamas, only when you yourselves know in your own experience that these things are good, that these things are not blamable, that these things are praised by the wise, undertaken and observed to lead to benefit and happiness in you, should you abide in them. Just as social prohibitions on what ideas to let into your consciousness are anathema to Buddhism, so also must restrictions on what plants to let in. Tibetan Buddhists, for one, have developed over centuries a wide field of psychopharmacology and an endless number of psychiatric botanical medicines, practically none of which have been scientifically tested or even identified in the West. When I use the term psychedelics, also called entheogens, which I find acceptable despite my agnostic Buddhist perspective, I am referring to the use of plant materials to expand consciousness and then trigger primary spiritual experience. And I think that's really the test in terms of Buddhism and psychedelics. The test being, does it generate compassion? The problems caused by cocaine and heroin and GHB and ketamine and methamphetamines and other consciousness-constricting drugs, and I know they have their fans, are indisputable and, as far as I'm concerned, hard to defend. The notion that all drugs are fundamentally alike is at the root of the confusion in our drug laws and the social debate around them. Drugs differ, uses and occasions differ, and policies and practices ought to also differ appropriately. Drug use will always be with us. So therefore, it seems reasonable that recreational users of psychedelics, who are also responsible users, should be treated more or less the same as recreational drinkers. Medical users of psychedelics should be treated essentially the same as anyone using commercial psychopharmaceuticals for their health. Spiritual users of psychedelics should be respected as any seekers of greater wisdom desiring shifts in consciousness. Too slowly are we collectively grasping the reality that the use of dangerous drugs are more of a medical issue than a legal one. Psychedelics used as a sacrament is well known throughout history, but it's interesting how now they are intersecting at a time when there's a massive and burgeoning wave of interest in self-development and self-fulfillment. Until the recent past, awareness about the deepest occult or hidden parts of our spirit selves were considered the private preserve of shamans and priests or spiritual masters that had earned access to it. Religious experience was mediated by these authorized few. And this is a tradition still with us in form as well as in attitude of many religions to this day. The democratization of psychedelics and of Buddhism, to a similar extent, has been very much about the breakdown of restricted access to the divine. In Buddhism, as in psychedelics, the individual takes responsibility for their relationship to the source of their being and for accessing the highest states of mind. Awareness of the relatedness between people, between objects, and particularly the intimate understanding of the interrelated nature of opposites are among the key insights that psychedelic travelers often bring home from their plant-assisted pilgrimages. Perhaps the popularization of both Zen and psychedelics have a major role in shifting the cultural mind from a dominantly Cartesian linear view of reality towards a mode of awareness that is more ecological and more holistic. Awareness is growing and it's a relative human construct and not a reflection of some objective reality. This way of seeing is not something people necessarily need psychedelics to experience. In fact, it's one of the central premises underlying Zen and the doctrine of non-duality. This emergent worldview brings us closer to a perspective that is perhaps equally comfortable being described as dharmic or psychedelic. Putting aside myriad well-founded arguments both for use and not use of psychedelics, there's an essential Buddhist response to the entrenched, ongoing, devastating so-called war on drugs, and that is compassion. I'd like to highlight this issue just a little more. Despite the apparent fading or falling of the Berlin Wall of prohibition, draconian drug laws still ensnare millions of otherwise law-abiding people in prisons in an ever-growing spiral of wasteful and counterproductive strategies, the foundation of which is punishment. It has resulted in an incarceration rate so unimaginable that 1 in 5 of people behind bars in the entire world are in prisons in America. At this very moment, American jails and prisons hold thousands of people, vastly disproportionately people of color, whose only crime is possession of plants. Prisons become classrooms for more advanced crime. Drugs are readily available to everyone from school children on up. Criminals outspend and outsmart police, and no one feels safer. The drug wars led to cynicism and apathy, and of course continues to blight thousands of lives. At the latest casualty, actually, in the failed war of drugs is our personal liberties. A society that actively banishes personal exploration with all psychedelic plants will need to very closely monitor its citizens. All of our communications, transactions, and expressions are under dramatically increasing surveillance by a growing bureaucracy of control and repression. None of this is conducive to the peaceful and free contemplation of strategies for our personal liberation and fulfillment. In reality, this ceases to be a war on drugs, but rather becomes a war on consciousness, a war on the free exercise of that most precious of gifts bestowed on human beings. Human history can arguably be seen as a series of relationships with plants, relationships made and broken. Plants, drugs, politics, religions have all harshly intermingled, from the influence of sugar on mercantilism to the influence on coffee and modern office worker, to the British forcing opium on the Taoist Chinese, to credible reports that the CIA used heroin in the ghettos of America to choke off dissent and dissatisfaction. The lessons learned can be raised into consciousness, integrated into social policy, and used to create a more caring and meaningful world, or they can be denied with the results now plainly seen. The enhanced capacity for extraordinary cognitive experience made possible by the use of plant psychedelics may be as basic a part of our humanity as our spirituality or our sexuality. The question is, how quickly can we evolve our collective maturity sufficiently to have an informed and balanced examination of these issues? As the eminent thinker Houston Smith is fond of pointing out, while psychedelic use is all about altered states, Buddhism is all about altered traits, and one does not necessarily lead to the other. One Theravada monk likened the mind on psychedelics to an image of a tree whose branches are overladen with low-hanging, very overripe and heavy fruit. The danger that the heavy fruit is too full and rich to be digested by the tree at all, and will weigh down the branches and cause them to snap. On the other hand, Alan Watts, one of the first prominent Westerners to follow the Buddhist path, considered both Buddhism and psychedelics as part of an ideal individual philosophical quest. He was not interested in Buddhism to be studied and defined in such a way as to avoid mixing it up with other interests or disciplines, such as quantum theory, Gestalt psychology, aesthetics, or certainly psychedelics. One time when Alan Watts was giving an Esalen lecture in California, he was asked, which is the best path to enlightenment, psychedelics or meditation? He chuckled thoughtfully and then he said, well, I don't know about a best way, but you can take a plane to New York or you can walk. While it's clear that Buddhism and psychedelics inform each other, their intersection also makes room for much confusion. We ought to continue to have this conversation. Surely it's only when we have the courage to see the truth in every other voice do we see what is relatively real in our own. I'd like to stop here and use the balance of time for questions, comments, and criticism. Thank you.
Okay, so we have 10 minutes for questions, and as you can see, we've struggled even to provide a microphone for the speaker, so we're not going to have a roving microphone for the questions, so you have to shout. So take it away, audience. Yeah.
Yes, I read a while ago, I forget which Tibetan Buddhist monk it was, but they described the LSD experience as super samsara. Super samsara. I wonder if you could say what you think is meant by that.
Well, not knowing the source of that might be a challenge, but what comes to mind when you say super samsara is the notion that samsara is itself also nirvana. That nirvana and samsara are not really separable. They describe different aspects of the same thing. So a super samsara, I think, would be the realization of that, perhaps. I don't know. It's a guess.
Sorry to ask this question, but what connection would you see between what's happening in the Far East with regard to Buddhists and Muslims and the Buddhism that you talk about?
You mean, I'm not sure I understand.
There's a lot of trouble going on in the Far East with
Yes.
Muslims against Buddhists. The Buddhists are killing Muslims, pushing them away, making sure they have no papers, making sure they have no
You're
society.
talking about Tamils.
Yeah, no.
Myanmar.
Yeah. What connection is there between that? It's sort of difficult to understand.
Okay, well, of course it is, and there's a way of looking at it that isn't completely on target, but it is a way of seeing it for purposes of this question, which is that, there's a difference of opinion about what Buddhism is. Is it a philosophy? Is it a religion? Is it a nationality? I tend towards the philosophy myself. When you adopt it as a religion, I think then you become a Buddhist, and you practice Buddhism, and everyone else is different than you, and it's the same dynamic of every religion. my God is better than your God, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So it becomes that same war, and human beings, Buddhist or otherwise, have that frailty and that are able to be seduced by that thinking. Can you hear me in the back?
Yeah.
Fine. So I would have to point to that as the real problem, that if somebody is practicing the teachings of the Buddha, they're not killing someone else. They're not killing other people. Because the first precept of Buddhism is do not kill. So people who practice a religion or call themselves Buddhists, there are far more people who identify with a religion called Buddhism than are actually practicing the teachings of the Buddha. Obviously.
I've been reading a bit recently about people. You said at one point that psychedelics in your daily life as a practicing, I don't know if they put it, but if you were practicing meditation and that it's separate to using psychedelics in your daily life. You can make a comment there that said they were not compatible.
Well, no, I don't mean to suggest that meditation and practice. Are you referring to the question that was given to Alan Watts?
No, it was towards the beginning. I can't remember exactly the comment. But basically, I've been reading a lot about people microdosing LSD and using it for meditation. I wonder if you've heard or shed that light.
I have heard about it. I haven't practiced it, but it's been. I've actually thought that. I mean, my response to people who have talked to me about it, it's been a very encouraging practice. I think. I mean, it sounds like it's working from the people who I've talked to about it, and I would think it's a very interesting thing to do. You can try.
What was the question?
He was talking about. Good point. He was talking about microdosing LSD and in the context of a meditation practice. If you're going to microdose with LSD, I can't think of a better context to do it in. And you know, if you're not getting the results you want in your meditation practice, maybe microdosing with LSD is worth trying. So.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So, you know, we know that the subjective experience of the psychedelic state, the sense of peace and tranquility and silence that it gives is subjectively similar to what people describe as a meditative state. And there's increasing neurobiological evidence now, and looking at people in scanners, suggesting the brain state is the same as well. Do you have any comments to make on that? I mean, is it helpful to be able to suggest there's a common neurobiological substrate for the two states?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's helpful. You know, that's probably very much part of why I have focused on these two disciplines coming together. They do create, not only do they create similar brain states in temporal time, but they also change the brain in the same ways. That you can have experiences both in intensive meditation and in the use of psychedelics that actually produce lasting changes of a positive nature.
Simple comment to say thank you very much for a very lucid explanation.
Yes, Dave.
Is there a danger of one craving the experience provided by LSD and plants, and therefore the experience itself becomes an issue?
Yes.
One then craves the experience.
I'd have to say yes. And it's a very good question, because I think some people do find that they have an addictive relationship, not only to drugs or anything, just that they have addictive tendencies. And so if you have an experience that's delightful and that's revealing and that you want more of it and you start to crave it, I think that's obviously starting to work against what the Buddhist path is, which is to avoid craving, to experience everything in the present moment, to let go of things. And so that would be an issue. That would be a conflict, a potential conflict that could arise.